Mercedes just had their worst performance of the year. Pace-wise, statistically, and points-wise. It wasn't a Grand Prix to remember. But I know exactly why it was bad, why the next Grand Prix they're going to go into will actually be a track that they're probably favored at. I want to first talk and really touch on Lewis Hamilton first, before diving into the deeper details of Austria and going into Silverstone. Lewis Hamilton has a contract that he is going to sign within really probably the upcoming next couple weeks. I would say that Silverstone would probably be a perfect spot for him to sign at, but Austria was definitely a different looking weekend for Hamilton. I personally think that they did not set up the car at all correctly for Hamilton going into this Grand Prix. I think the FP1 really screwed over a lot of teams, and the only team that really was able to nail it was Red Bull, and I think Ferrari actually came pretty much prepared as well. The car just wasn't really suited to his style, so we got a lot of negative messages, a lot of interesting interviews, a couple that I'll pop up onto the screen.
We weren't expecting to be as slow as we were either, so but this track just highlighted some areas for us to work on, and yeah, not the greatest of days. I didn't really have any fun battles out there. I was slow, so I was just going backwards.
I mean, Lewis definitely wasn't a happy camper in this Grand Prix, and not really to blame him. The car just wasn't performing well. I think a lot of people are going to go at him and call him a crybaby and so on, but I think the bigger thing to take out of this is he is still so much in that really competitive nature. We got to remember, the guy was right there to 8 titles, and it practically got stripped from him in the very last second. It is a very interesting situation. If I were Lewis, I would be in the same kind of boat. Like, you have to wait now. 2022 wasn't great. So now 2023, yet again, is not another winning year. It's frustrating to say the least if I'm looking at it from the perspective of Lewis Hamilton. So I understand his frustrations coming about. I get, first of all, they did not go in the car direction that he wanted. The W13 wasn't the car that he wanted. W14 is not the car that he wanted. Now, the W15 is supposedly going to be the car that Hamilton wants. They have made improvements, some slightly more than others, which I will, like I said, mention later on in the video, but it isn't to his liking. So we get those radio messages, the car is slow, the track limits. He was also pushed really like one of the only drivers that I can remember in the very beginning of the race that got caught out with that. And I guarantee if we look back at the replay, Lando probably ran that a bunch of times. Fernando probably ran that a bunch of times. Sergio probably ran that a bunch of times. Max had no track limit penalties, which I find really hard to believe, but there is just no way that only the 5 drivers got penalties like Albon and everybody else, and then everybody else kind of just got away with that. I don't tend to believe that that happened, because this track just kind of promotes that, and the amount of times that your rear end can really snap out from either turns 9 or 10, there has to be some type of way of penalties. It was definitely an interesting race for Lewis. I gotta say, it was, I think, his weakest Grand Prix. I think he had no pace at all. I think without the penalty, Fernando was still catching him. I think they were really strongly the 4th fastest car there. McLaren in Lando's hands was faster than him, but I think even if Lewis was actually able to catch up to Lando, he would have been able to overtake him. I think the Aston and the Mercedes had the pace. Regardless, I think Lewis has been having an outstanding season. I think with the exception of maybe like Jeddah, he has had an amazing, really, season. Every single Grand Prix, he has kicked George Russell's butt. He has been doing exactly what's been told of him at the age that he's at. He's having just as impressive a season as Alonso. Alonso just has the better car. In this aspect, Alonso's my favorite driver, but I can admit that Alonso has probably the faster car on more tracks, better in certain little aspects. Regardless of that, I want to talk about the car. Why did it perform so badly on this track? And like I said, after the bad performance, I want to get into why it's going to be a favorite into the next track. Talking here in Austria, I knew coming into the Grand Prix, they weren't going to be that quick. I think Toto said they were going to be somewhere 2nd or 3rd. I did not believe that was going to happen. I actually thought that this car was going to perform the way that it did perform. I think the next track will suit them a lot better. The reasoning being, this track is very much rear-oriented. So I spoke about this in my last video, and I'm going to touch on it right now too. The car is still missing a lot of downforce in its rear end. It's why these upgrades coming into Silverstone will really focus on that. The rear end of the car is just weak. The side pod design has actually allowed them to have better rear stability. The W13 also had weak rear stability. It's missing the touch that Hamilton really loves into a car. And I guarantee George Russell is probably feeling the same way. He's not really liking it. He has been very uncomfortable, to say the least, with this car in the 2023 season, especially since Monaco. But since Monaco, they've had more really downforce on that rear end because of the side pod concept. Aston Martin used those waterfall slide pods, as we called them, to give the car better rear stability. They have a great rear. They've really focused in and honed in on changing those side pods to even more give them that advantage going into really rear-oriented corners. Now, while the car isn't fantastic in rear, it's still a lot better than the Mercedes. The Mercedes is one of the weakest, especially going into traction zones like turns 3, turns 4, and that's why Lewis Hamilton got the track limits in Austria going into turn 9 and 10, because he had to flick the car more. The car just isn't able to really perform under certain traction zones. He isn't able to step on really the throttle as high as possible without other cars. Like if you watch Max Verstappen's on board for even turn 3, that guy's on full throttle practically right after making the turn. Most cars have to go from a steady mid to then go to full throttle. He's going from here to here. It's a ridiculous margin that Red Bull has on every other car. It's just so slick in that. And that really lies in the suspension too. This is still a new suspension that they're kind of adapting to, this anti-dive suspension that's able to actually lower their car and really get them better into the braking zones. He was actually complaining about the braking zones in the Grand Prix as well in Austria, especially into turn 3. He had to brake way earlier than most other cars. Hence how Carlos Sainz was able to make a huge deep dive onto him. The car isn't hitting those brake zones like other cars on the track. It's still struggling a lot in that. So on tracks like Spain, on tracks like Silverstone, where most of the track is medium to high speed corners and you don't have to put your effort into braking and gaining most of your time there, that is where this Mercedes excels at, because the downforce on the car going into high speed corners is pretty planted. It's a gravel machine when it needs to be. But in slow speed and in traction zones, the car is just struggling. And I feel like this will be an ongoing problem for them going into the year without the upgrades coming, I think, in Silverstone and Spa, if they can really, with this chassis, make improvements to that car. But James Allison has said that there should be improvements to this car coming to the rear end. It's not done for this year, even though they are focusing on the W15 already. With that out of the way though, we saw their worst performance, and I think we're about to see their best here in Silverstone. My reasoning being, and I'm going to explain it perfectly why. This whole track is high speed and medium speed corners. There is one zone where Mercedes will lack to the Red Bull, and that will be going into the first DRS zone, that first little traction zone that's rear oriented. Everything else on this car is front limited. Going into the S's, going into Cups, going into Sector 3, all of this is front oriented, which really suits the Mercedes car and does not go to the strengths of the Red Bull. Tire management will be important here. Last year, actually, Hamilton would have probably had, I think he would have caught Carlos. I don't know if he would have caught Charles if the safety car didn't come. They played a beautiful tire strategy. They performed extremely well in the race, and that car with kind of the same attributes to the W14, with the exception, I think the W14 is still stronger. It was very strong here and as competitive as the Red Bull and the Ferrari. Now, we weren't able to see Max Verstappen's true pace last year there, but we do know that Ferrari was as strong, if not even a little bit stronger on this track. Leclerc had the pace to be catching Verstappen. Carlos, if he was actually hitting the corners right, had the pace to win the race. This will be a track, like I said, and I will mention time and time again, if it's any track that we're going to get a different race winner, it will be here for Lewis Hamilton or George Russell. Now, going off of what we've had in the last couple of Grand Prix, George and Lewis have definitely had, I would definitely say Lewis has been killing them. It's been a struggle for George in this new car. I don't think that he has been as on it as he was with the car with less rear-oriented. I think he likes the car more flicky, kind of like Max Verstappen. We do know that Lewis loves his rear end. So yeah, it's definitely been in the advantage of Lewis Hamilton. And I think in Silverstone, we will see the same. The guy is what, a 6-7 time winner in Silverstone. He loves the circuit. Charles Leclerc also loves the circuit, and they will be strong there too, but I don't believe that any car will be stronger than the actual W14 going into this Silverstone track. But let me know your thoughts down below. What are your guys' opinion on Mercedes so far this year? Do you feel like the Austria Grand Prix was a fluke? Do you feel like this will continue this trend? And what are your thoughts about really Lewis Hamilton's situation in Mercedes? Will he sign a contract this weekend? Let me know your thoughts down below. Please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world, and peace.